The ship's soul's promise dropped out of hyperspace with a flash of blue light that painted the massive ring world ahead in strange colors. Kang Daeho stood at the observation deck watching Nexus Prime grow larger through the transparent metal windows, and felt his heart beat faster despite years of training to stay calm. The ring world was bigger than anything humans had ever built, and it spun slowly around a yellow star that looked almost like Earth's sun. But Daeho knew this was over 3,000 light years from Home Park. Minji walked up beside him holding a data pad filled with translation protocols and cultural notes about the hundreds of alien species they were about to meet. She was young for such an important mission, but her gift for languages had made her the best choice when humanity needed someone who could understand not just words, but the meaning behind them. The ring stretched across space like a giant metal bracelet covered in cities that glowed with lights of every color imaginable, and ships moved between them like tiny insects around flowers. Daeho had studied the images and videos for months, but seeing Nexus Prime with his own eyes made him understand why the Galactic Council thought they ruled the galaxy. Behind them, Captain Yu Jae-won announced over the ship's communication system that they would dock in 30 minutes and all crew should prepare for their first contact with galactic civilization. The other human ships in their small fleet had already taken positions around Sol's Promise in a formation that looked protective, but not threatening. Daeho had spent weeks planning every detail of their arrival because he knew the aliens would judge humanity based on these first moments. Through the windows, he could see alien ships of designs that seemed impossible floating near the docking ports, and some of them were watching the human fleet with what looked like curiosity. Park Minji pointed to a group of crystalline ships that sparkled like jewels and said those belonged to the Nexari, who were supposed to be one of the oldest species in the Council. The docking process took another hour as automated systems guided Sol's Promise through traffic patterns that had been used for thousands of years. When the ship finally settled into its assigned berth, Daeho could see aliens moving on the docking platform outside, and most of them stopped to stare at the humans. Some looked almost like people, but with different colored skin or extra arms, while others were so strange that Daeho had trouble understanding how they moved or communicated. The airlock opened with a soft hiss, and breathable atmosphere flowed in, carrying scents that were both familiar and completely alien. 3 figures waited for them on the platform, and Daeho recognized them from the briefing materials as official council greeters. The first was tall and thin with blue skin and 4 arms, wearing robes that seemed to shift color as it moved. The second looked like a walking tree with bark-like skin and leaves growing from its shoulders. The third was the most human-like, with pale green skin and large black eyes that seemed to look right through Daeho when their gazes met. The blue-skinned alien stepped forward and spoke in heavily accented but understandable English, welcoming them to Nexus Prime on behalf of the Galactic Council. Daeho responded with the formal greeting he had practiced and noticed how other aliens on the platform moved closer to listen. Park Minji activated her translation device and began recording everything for later analysis. The tree-like being explained that they would be escorted to temporary quarters where they could rest before appearing before the council in 2 days. As they walked through corridors that seemed designed for creatures much larger than humans, Daeho observed everything around him. The walls were covered with symbols and artwork from dozens of different species, and the ceiling was so high that flying creatures moved through the air above their heads. Other aliens they passed ranged from tiny insect-like beings to massive creatures that moved on multiple legs, and some stopped their conversations to watch the humans go by. In the residential section, they were assigned rooms that had been modified for human needs, but Daeho could tell the original design was meant for beings that were taller and had different body shapes. That evening, Park Minji brought him reports from the other human delegation members who had been exploring their assigned areas and talking to any aliens willing to communicate. Most of the alien species seemed curious about humans, but several had made comments suggesting they thought humans were primitive or dangerous. The Vorthan delegation had apparently referred to humans as barely evolved primates, while the Kronar representatives had called them another warlike species, Li Huan. From the diplomatic team had attended a formal dinner, where several alien ambassadors had openly discussed whether humanity should be allowed to continue expanding into space. The conversations she overheard suggested that many council members saw humans as a problem to be solved rather than potential. Allies to be welcomed. Daiho spent the night reading intelligence reports that human agents had gathered about the council's internal politics over the past several years. The information painted a picture of an organization that had maintained peace through strict control and careful management of expansion rights. Most species that joined the council were required to limit their growth and accept assigned territories that kept them from competing with established powers. The system worked to prevent wars, but it also seemed designed to make sure that no new species could challenge the existing order. As Daiho reviewed the files, he began to understand that humanity's rapid expansion had probably frightened many council members who were used to slower, more controlled development. The next day brought a series of meetings with various alien officials who explained council procedures and protocols. Each conversation felt like a test where the aliens were trying to determine how much humans understood about galactic politics. Daiho answered their questions carefully while asking his own questions that seemed innocent, but gave him information about how the council really operated. By the end of the second day, he had confirmed what human intelligence had suspected for years. The Galactic Council was not really interested in welcoming humanity as an equal member, but rather in finding a way to control human expansion before it threatened their carefully maintained status. The formal summons to appear before the full council arrived that evening, delivered by a floating robot that spoke in a mechanical voice. Park Minji translated the formal language, which was full of legal terms and diplomatic phrases. But the basic message was clear. Humanity was being called to account for their actions and would need to justify their right to continue expanding into space. That night, Daiho stood again at his room's window, looking out at the lights of Nexus Prime and thinking about the thousands of species that called this place home. Tomorrow he would walk into a chamber filled with beings who had ruled the galaxy for millennia, and most of them had already decided that humanity was a threat to be contained. But Daiho had spent his entire career preparing for moments like this, and he knew that sometimes the most important battles were won not with weapons, but with words and careful planning. He checked his notes one final time and smiled slightly as he thought about what the council expected him to say and what he actually planned to tell them. The next morning would bring humanity's first formal address to the Galactic Council, and Daiho was ready to make sure it was a speech that no one in that chamber would ever forget. The council chamber was even more impressive than the images had suggested, with a dome that stretched so high above them that small clouds actually formed near the ceiling. Daiho walked beside Park Minji down the long pathway that led to the speaking platform, while thousands of alien beings watched from tiered seating that rose up the curved walls. The air hummed with translation devices and whispered conversations in languages that sounded like music or static, or sounds that had no human equivalent. At the center of the chamber sat the council leadership on a raised platform that slowly rotated so they could address different sections of the audience. Veltar of the hegemony was easy to identify because of the flowing golden robes and the crown-like device that floated above what Daiho assumed was its head. The being's features were hidden behind a shimmering field, but when it spoke, its voice carried clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems. The formal session began with ancient rituals that involved lights and sounds, and what might have been singing from species whose vocal cords worked differently than human ones. Daiho had been briefed about these ceremonies, but experiencing them in person made him understand how old this organization really was. When the preliminaries finally ended, Veltar announced that the Council would hear charges against the species known as humanity. General Thekmol of the Kronar Imperium rose from his seat and moved to the accusation platform with steps that shook the floor beneath his massive frame. The general was over 3 meters tall with armor-like skin and arms that ended in claws designed for tearing metal. When he spoke, his voice boomed through the chamber like thunder, and every word carried the weight of military authority. The first holographic display showed a map of human expansion over the past 20 years, with red dots marking each new colony and green lines showing trade routes. Thekmol pointed at the display and declared that no species in galactic history had expanded so aggressively in such a short time. The second display showed human military vessels, and the general noted that even civilian ships carried weapons systems. He explained that this violated Council protocols that required peaceful species to maintain only defensive capabilities. The third display was more detailed and showed human population growth with numbers that made several alien delegates gasp in surprise. Thekmol stated that humans had tripled their numbers in 50 years and were consuming resources at rates that threatened entire star systems. As each accusation was presented, Deho watched the reactions of different alien species around the chamber. Some nodded in agreement, while others seemed more interested in the technical details of human expansion. A few groups whispered among themselves, and Daiho noticed that Park Minji was recording these conversations with her translation equipment. When Thekmol finished his presentation, other council members were invited to add their own concerns about humanity. Silene of the Ethereal Collective spoke next, and her voice sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. She called humans parasites that multiplied without regard for the delicate balance that had maintained galactic peace for millennia. Her accusations focused on environmental damage and resource depletion in systems where humans had established colonies. The holographic evidence she presented showed before and after images of several star systems. But Deho noticed that the data seemed incomplete. Kretak of the Skyborn Federation was the next to speak, and his bird-like appearance matched his sharp voice. He focused on military concerns and presented intelligence. Reports about human weapons technology. According to his data, humans had developed faster-than-light weapons and defensive systems that were decades ahead of Council standards. He argued that any species capable of such rapid military advancement represented a clear threat to galactic stability. As the accusations continued, Deho began to see patterns in how different species approached the human problem. The older, more established civilizations seemed most concerned about maintaining their positions of power. Younger species that had joined the Council more recently appeared more curious than frightened. Several smaller delegations seemed genuinely interested in learning more about human technology and culture. The most damaging testimony came from Ambassador Kelnari of the Trade Consortium, who presented economic data. According to his reports, human trade practices were disrupting established commercial relationships throughout the galaxy. Human merchants were offering better prices and faster delivery times than species that had controlled certain markets for centuries. Even worse, humans were sharing their technology freely with species that had previously been dependent on consortium services. This economic disruption was apparently causing political problems in several council member governments. As the day progressed, the weight of accusations grew heavier, and Li Haiwan looked increasingly worried about humanity's position. Each new speaker seemed to have found different reasons why humans represented a threat to the galactic order. By the time the afternoon session began, it was clear that most of the council had already decided that humanity needed to be contained. The proposed solutions ranged from limiting human expansion to their current 17 systems to forcing them back to Earth entirely. Some delegates suggested monitoring systems that would track every human ship and limit their access to certain technologies. Others proposed economic sanctions that would prevent humans from trading with most council species. The most extreme suggestion came from a species called the Purifiers, who wanted humans classified as a hostile civilization. Throughout all of these discussions, Daiho remained silent. While taking careful notes on his data, Park Minji continued recording everything and occasionally whispered translations of particularly important statements. Several times, Veltar asked if the human delegation wanted to respond to specific accusations, but Daiho simply requested permission to address all charges together. This unusual approach seemed to puzzle many of the alien delegates who were used to immediate responses and heated debates. As the accusations session neared its end, Thekmal returned to the platform for his closing statement. He summarized the charges against humanity and called for immediate action to prevent what he called an inevitable galactic war. According to the general, humans were following the same pattern as previous aggressive species that had eventually been destroyed by their own violence. He presented historical data about 3 previous civilizations that had expanded rapidly and then collapsed within a few hundred years. The implication was clear that humans would either destroy themselves or be destroyed by others if they were allowed to continue their current path. When Thekmal finished speaking, the chamber fell silent except for the quiet hum of translation devices. Veltar announced that the human delegation would be given the opportunity to respond to all charges the following day as the session ended and aliens began filing out of the chamber. Daiho finally stood and walked toward the exit. Several alien delegates approached him as he left, but he politely declined their attempts at conversation. Park Minji gathered her recording equipment and followed him through corridors that buzzed with discussions about the day's testimony. That evening, she presented him with analysis of the alien conversations she had recorded throughout the day. Most species seemed convinced that humans were dangerous, but there were interesting variations in their reasoning. Some feared human military capabilities, while others were more concerned about economic competition. A few species seemed genuinely curious about human culture and technology, despite the negative testimony. The most important discovery was that several minor species had privately expressed interest in closer relationships with humanity. These smaller civilizations apparently saw humans as potential allies against the dominance of older council powers. As Daiho reviewed the day's events, he realized that the council's greatest fear was not that humans were violent or destructive. Their real concern was that humanity represented change in a system designed to prevent any significant changes. Tomorrow, he would have his chance to address these fears and present humanity's true position. But tonight, he needed to finalize his strategy for turning the council's expectations completely upside down. The second day brought a different energy to the council chamber, as thousands of alien beings waited to hear how humanity would defend itself against the serious charges. Daiho walked to the speaking platform with slow, deliberate steps that seemed calm, but Park Minji noticed how every movement was carefully calculated. When he reached the center of the platform, he stood quietly for several long moments, looking up at the tiered seating where alien delegates watched him with expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility. The chamber gradually fell silent as beings stopped their conversations and focused their attention on the human ambassador. Veltar spoke the traditional words that gave Daiho permission to address the council. But there was something different in the leader's tone. Instead of starting immediately with a defense against the accusations, Daiho simply asked a question that seemed almost casual. How long has the Galactic Council maintained peace? Veltar answered proudly that the council had kept the galaxy stable for over 3,000 years. Daiho nodded thoughtfully and asked his second question. In those 3,000 years, how many new species have achieved faster-than-light travel and joined this council? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and even though no one answered immediately, everyone in the chamber understood the implication. The silence stretched longer as delegates realized that very few species had made that technological leap. During the Council's entire existence, Daeho began walking slowly around the platform as he continued speaking in a conversational tone that somehow carried to every corner of the massive chamber. He acknowledged that humans had indeed expanded rapidly into 17 star systems and built colonies faster than most species, but he asked whether rapid growth was inherently dangerous or simply unfamiliar to civilizations that had grown comfortable with slow, controlled development. The first holographic display appeared above the platform, showing not human expansion but council expansion patterns over the past millennium. The data revealed that most council species had actually contracted their territories during that time, rather than growing. Outward Daeho pointed out that while the council celebrated 3,000 years of peace, it had also overseen 3,000 years of stagnation. Species after species had accepted limited growth quotas and restricted expansion rights until they became dependent on council approval for basic decisions. He showed statistics proving that technological advancement among council species had slowed dramatically since the peace accords were established. The most powerful civilizations had apparently decided that preventing conflict was more important than encouraging progress. Several alien delegates began shifting uncomfortably in their seats as Daeho's presentation revealed patterns they had never considered. His next display showed population data for major council species over the past 1,000 years. While human population had tripled in 50 years, most alien civilizations had maintained static or declining numbers for centuries. Daeho suggested that this might indicate not stability, but a kind of cultural death where species stopped believing in their own future. The chamber erupted in angry voices as delegates objected to his characterization of their societies, but Daeho raised his hand, and somehow the simple gesture caused the noise to fade. He acknowledged that peace was valuable, but asked whether peace without growth was really living, or just an elaborate form of extinction. His tone remained respectful, but his words carried implications that shook the foundation of everything the Council believed about itself. When he moved to address the military accusations, Daeho took a completely unexpected approach. Instead of denying that humans had advanced weapons, he confirmed that human military technology was indeed sophisticated, but he pointed out that if humans were truly aggressive, they would not be standing in this chamber asking for dialogue. A species with hostile intentions would simply take what they wanted, rather than seeking permission or approval. He activated a new display that showed human colonies and trade routes, but with additional data that had not been presented the previous day. Every human settlement included medical facilities that provided free treatment to any species that requested. Human trade vessels carried emergency supplies and had standing orders to assist any ship in distress, regardless of its origin. Most surprising of all, human colonies had actually improved the star systems they occupied by cleaning up space, debris, and establishing navigation beacons. Choi Wonho appeared as a holographic witness from the mining station New Seoul, and his testimony challenged many of the previous day's accusations. The engineer explained how human mining operations used techniques that actually restored damaged environments rather than exploiting them. He presented before and after data showing that several star systems were healthier after human colonization than they had been for centuries. His evidence included examples of human teams working with local alien populations to solve environmental problems. When Veltar asked why this information had not been provided to the Council earlier, Choi answered that no one had asked for it. The casual response drew nervous laughter from some delegates who were beginning to realize that their intelligence about humanity might be incomplete. Daeho then called his second witness through the holographic communication system. Captain Kim Jae-seok of the freighter, New Busan, appeared to testify about an incident that had occurred 6 months earlier. His ship had responded to a distress signal from a Vorthan research vessel that was under attack by pirates. Even though humans had no treaty obligations with the Vorthan government, Kim's crew had risked their lives to drive off the attackers. The Vorthan delegation looked uncomfortable, as this story contradicted their earlier characterization of humans as primitive and selfish. Kim's testimony revealed that such incidents were not unusual, and that human ships regularly provided assistance without expecting payment or recognition. Several other quick testimonies followed from human civilians who had helped alien communities with everything from medical emergencies to natural disasters. Each story painted a picture of a species that was generous and helpful rather than aggressive and threatening. But Daiho saved his most powerful evidence for the end of his presentation. Dr. Yoon Suji appeared as his final witness to discuss the Human Medical Exchange Program. Over the past 2 years, human doctors had shared treatments for diseases that had plagued certain council species for generations. The Ethereal Collective had been struggling with a plague that killed their young until human researchers developed a cure. The Skyborn Federation had lost thousands of members to a genetic disorder that human gene therapy could prevent. In every case, humans had shared their medical advances freely, without demanding territory or political concessions. As Dr. Yoon presented her data, several alien delegates began whispering among themselves. The evidence was becoming overwhelming that humans were not the threat they had been portrayed as. Daiho walked back to the center of the platform, and his voice became stronger as he addressed the core issue. The council had based its accusations on fear of change rather than evidence of actual harm. Human expansion was rapid because humans believed in growth and exploration rather than accepting artificial limits. Human ships carried weapons because the galaxy contained real dangers like pirates and hostile forces. Human population growth was healthy because humans had not given up on their future the way many council species apparently had. He pointed out that in 20 years of expansion, humans had not conquered a single alien settlement or forced any species from their traditional territories. Instead, they had improved trade relationships, established beneficial partnerships, and contributed to galactic civilization. The most damning evidence came when Daiho revealed that humans had been quietly solving problems that the Council had been unable to address for decades. Human merchant ships had reduced piracy in 3 sectors by establishing patrol routes. Human medical teams had contained disease outbreaks that threatened entire civilizations. Human engineers had repaired critical infrastructure that council species had abandoned as too expensive to maintain. As his presentation concluded, Daiho stood silently for a moment, letting the weight of his evidence settle over the chamber. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet confidence that made every being present pay attention. Real question facing the Council was not whether humanity was dangerous, but whether the Council was brave enough to embrace the changes that humanity represented. He suggested that the galaxy's 3,000 years of stagnation might finally be coming to an end, and that was not something to fear, but something to celebrate. The atmosphere in the council chamber had shifted dramatically as Daiho prepared to reveal information that would change how every species viewed humanity. Forever Park Minji watched the alien delegates carefully and noticed that many were leaning forward in their seats while others appeared nervous about what they might hear next. Daiho activated a new holographic display that showed detailed technical specifications for human military vessels. Instead of hiding their capabilities, he began explaining exactly how advanced human weapons really were. The plasma cannons on human destroyers could penetrate any known shield technology. The missile systems carried warheads powerful enough to crack moons. The defensive barriers could withstand sustained bombardment from entire fleets. As he presented each system, the chamber grew quieter because many delegates realized that human ships were not primitive, as they had believed. Veltar interrupted to ask why humans had concealed these capabilities. During previous diplomatic contacts, Daiho replied calmly that humans had never concealed anything, but no one had asked the right questions. The distinction seemed subtle, but it carried enormous implications about how the Council gathered intelligence. General, Thekmol demanded to know how many of these advanced ships humanity possessed. Deho paused for a moment before answering that humanity had over 2,000 military vessels scattered across their territory. The number sent shockwaves through the chamber, because most Council species maintained fleets of fewer than 100 ships. But Daiho was not finished with his revelations about human military strength. He explained that every human civilian ship was built with military-grade components and could be converted to combat status within hours. The merchant vessels carried hidden weapon systems that could be activated when needed. Even the mining platforms had defensive capabilities that could destroy attacking fleets. The total number of ships that could be used for military purposes exceeded 10,000. Several alien delegates began demanding explanations for why humanity had built such a massive force. Deho's answer was simple and terrifying in its implications. Because could he explain that human military technology had developed during centuries of warfare on Earth, where survival required constant innovation? When humans reached space, they naturally built their ships with the same defensive mindset. No central authority had ordered the militarization of human space assets. It had happened organically because humans refused to be helpless against unknown threats. The next revelation came when Deho addressed the Council's assumption that human expansion was uncontrolled and chaotic. He activated a display showing the real scope of human space exploration. While humans had officially colonized 17 systems, they had actually surveyed over 300. They knew the locations of resources rare, metals and strategic positions throughout a vast region of space. More importantly, they knew the positions and capabilities of every Council fleet within 50 light-years of human territory. The intelligence network humans had built was more comprehensive than anything the Council possessed. Park Minji provided data showing that humans had been monitoring Council communications for over 5 years. They understood the political relationships between different species. They knew which governments were stable and which were facing internal problems. They had identified the real power structures that operated behind the Council's official procedures. When Veltar asked how humanity had acquired such detailed intelligence, Deho's response shocked everyone present. Humans had simply asked questions and listened to answers. Most Council species shared information freely because they assumed humans were too primitive to understand its significance. Diplomatic conversations, trade negotiations, and cultural exchanges had provided a complete picture of galactic civilization. The Council's own openness had given humans every piece of information they needed, but the most devastating revelation was still to come. Deho explained that humanity had known about the Council's expansion restrictions for over 10 years. They understood the protocols that limited species growth and the political mechanisms used to enforce them. Human leaders had studied the system carefully before deciding how to approach galactic civilization. The choice to expand rapidly into 17 systems had been deliberate, not accidental. Humans had tested the Council's response by pushing boundaries that had never been challenged. Every colony, every trade route, every diplomatic contact had been part of a carefully planned strategy. The apparent chaos of human expansion was actually a sophisticated intelligence operation. As this information sank in, several alien delegates began to understand that they had been completely outmaneuvered by a species they had dismissed as primitive. Deho continued his presentation by revealing the true scope of human capabilities. Human scientists had developed faster-than-light communication systems that allowed instant coordination across their entire territory. Human engineers had created manufacturing techniques that could produce fleets faster than any Council species. Human economists had designed trade networks that were more efficient than systems that had operated for centuries. Most disturbing of all, human strategists had wargamed dozens of scenarios for conquering significant portions of Council space. The plans existed not because humans intended to use them, but because they refused to be unprepared for any possibility When General Thekmol demanded to see these conquest plans, Deho politely declined. But he did reveal one crucial detail that made every being in the chamber reconsider their position. The war games had concluded that humanity could control half the galaxy within 20 years if they chose violence over diplomacy. The only reason they had not done so was because they preferred cooperation to conquest. This statement hung in the air like a sword suspended over the entire council. For 3,000 years, the established powers had maintained control through careful management of resources and technology. Suddenly, they faced a species that could simply take what they wanted but chose not to. The psychological impact was enormous because it inverted the entire power dynamic. Instead of supplicants seeking acceptance, humans were revealed as equals, offering partnership. Veltar asked the question that everyone was thinking. If humans possessed such overwhelming advantages, why were they bothering with council approval at all? Deho's answer revealed the fundamental difference between humanity and most other species. Because conquest was easy, but building something better required cooperation. Humans had not come to the council to ask permission for their expansion. They had come to offer the galaxy a chance to grow beyond the limitations that had trapped it for millennia. The choice belonged to the council, not to humanity. They could try to contain a species that had already proven it could not be contained, or they could embrace the changes that would transform galactic civilization. As Deho concluded this section of his presentation, he made one final point that crystallized everything he had revealed. Humanity had spent 10 years studying the council before making contact. They had identified every weakness, every strength, and every possibility. The decision to seek diplomatic solutions had been made from a position of knowledge and power, not from desperation or need. The chamber fell silent as aliens throughout the vast space tried to process what they had learned. Everything they thought they knew about humanity had been wrong. The species they had planned to contain had been containing itself. The primitives they had intended to educate had been studying them. The threat they had meant to neutralize had been choosing restraint. Park Minji watched the alien faces around the chamber and saw fear, confusion, and something that might have been respect. The balance of power in the galaxy had shifted in a single presentation, and everyone present knew that nothing would ever be the same. The silence in the council chamber stretched for nearly 5 minutes as thousands of alien beings tried to understand what they had just learned about humanity. Deho stood calmly at the center of the platform, waiting for the shock to transform into action. When the first voices began to rise, they came from different sections of the chamber, at once creating a chaos of sound that grew louder with each passing moment. Some delegates were shouting accusations about deception, while others demanded immediate military action. A few species seemed more interested in the technology humans had described than in the political implications. Park Minji activated her recording equipment to capture everything, but the translation systems were struggling, with the overlapping conversations in dozens of languages. Through the noise, Veltar's voice boomed across the chamber calling for order, but many delegates ignored the command. General Thekmol rose from his seat, and his massive frame commanded attention, as he accused humans of planning galactic conquest, but his words were drowned out by counter-arguments from species that had benefited from human medical assistance. The ethereal collective delegate stood to defend the humans who had saved thousands of their young from plague. The Skyborn Federation representative argued that humans had proven their peaceful intentions through their actions. For nearly an hour, the chamber remained in chaos as different factions formed around competing interpretations of what they had heard. Some aliens wanted immediate sanctions against humanity, while others called for expanded cooperation. A few smaller species began suggesting that maybe the Council's restrictive policies were the real problem. Deho watched it all with patient interest, occasionally making notes on his data pad. When the noise finally began to fade, he raised his hand in a simple gesture that somehow cut through the remaining conversations. the chamber fell silent again, as every being present focused on the human ambassador. His voice when he spoke carried clearly to every corner of the vast space without any apparent effort. The choice before this council is simple. You can try to contain humanity and turn us into an enemy that will make your ancient nightmares seem like pleasant dreams. Or you can recognize that the galaxy has changed and it is time for the council to change with it. He activated a final holographic display that showed not military specifications or intelligence, reports, but a vision of what galactic civilization could become. Human colonies working alongside alien settlements to terraform dead worlds, mixed crews on exploration vessels pushing the boundaries of known space research stations where different species shared knowledge to solve problems that had existed for millennia. Trade networks that brought prosperity to civilizations that had been isolated for centuries. Medical centers where human and alien doctors worked together to eliminate diseases. The images were beautiful and compelling, but they were also clearly possible given what humans had already accomplished. Deho explained that humanity was offering full partnership not just in exploration and trade, but in reshaping how galactic civilization operated. The expansion restrictions that had limited growth for 3,000 years would be replaced with cooperative development programs. Species that wanted to grow would receive human assistance, while those that preferred stability would be protected. The military technologies that had frightened so many delegates would be shared with allies to create security for everyone. Most importantly, the Council itself would evolve from a regulatory body into a true cooperative alliance. But these changes would require courage from species that had grown comfortable with the status quo. Humanity would not force anyone to accept their vision, but they would also not be forced to accept limitations that served no useful purpose, as Deho outlined. The specific terms of human participation in galactic civilization, the chamber remained unusually quiet, equal membership in the council with voting rights proportional to their contribution, recognition of all existing human colonies and the right to continue expanding into unoccupied systems, revision of expansion protocols to encourage growth rather than restricting it, sharing of human medical and engineering advances with all council species, mutual defense agreements that would protect smaller civilizations from aggressive neighbors. When he finished his presentation, Veltar asked if the council could have time to discuss these proposals privately. Deho agreed but suggested that the discussion should not take too long. Humanity had been patient for 10 years while studying the council, but their patience was not unlimited. The human delegation withdrew to their quarters, while the council began what would become the longest continuous session in its 3,000-year history. For 18 hours, alien delegates argued about humanity's proposals. Some species wanted to reject everything and declare humans an enemy civilization. Others insisted that cooperation was the only realistic option given human capabilities. Few smaller civilizations saw this as their chance to break free from restrictions that had held them back for centuries. The breakthrough came when the Vorthan delegation admitted that humans had saved their research vessel without expecting anything. In return, if humans were truly aggressive, they would have let the ship be destroyed or demanded payment for their assistance. Similar testimonies followed from other species that had received unexpected help from human civilians. The pattern that emerged showed humans consistently choosing cooperation over conflict, even when they could have benefited from the chaos. When the council reconvened, the vote was not even close species. After species voted to accept humanity's terms, even some of their former opponents like the Kronar Imperium decided that partnership was preferable to conflict. The final count showed overwhelming support for bringing humans into the council as full members. But more importantly, it showed support for the changes that humanity represented as the session concluded with formal ceremonies welcoming Earth to galactic civilization. Veltar approached Deho privately. The council leader had removed the shimmering field that normally hid their features, revealing a face that looked almost human. "You planned this entire presentation," the alien said quietly. "Every word, every revelation, every moment of silence." Daiho nodded without any attempt to deny the obvious. "We studied you for 10 years before making contact. We knew exactly how you would react and exactly what we needed to say." Veltar seemed genuinely curious rather than angry about the manipulation, and if we had voted against you for the first time in the entire proceedings, Daiho smiled. The expression was warm and friendly, but it carried undertones that made Veltar step back involuntarily. Council leader, that was never really an option. The human ambassador explained that rejection would have forced humanity to demonstrate their capabilities. More directly, a few blockaded council worlds would have changed minds very quickly, but he was grateful that wisdom had prevailed over stubbornness. As the alien delegates filed out of the chamber, many stopped to speak with members of the human delegation. Conversations were cautious but positive, as species began to explore possibilities for cooperation. Park Minji found herself surrounded by linguists who wanted to understand how humans had learned to communicate so effectively. Daiho spent the evening meeting with representatives from smaller civilizations who were excited about the changes ahead. The Galactic Council had taken its first step toward becoming something greater than it had ever been. 3,000 years of stagnation were ending. Age of human ambition had begun that night as Daiho stood once again at his quarters window, looking out at the lights of Nexus Prime. He thought about the future. Tomorrow humans would take their place not just as another member of the Galactic Council, but as the catalyst that would transform it. The galaxy was about to remember what it meant to reach for the stars, and humanity would make sure it never forgot again.